Welcome to Dead and Roasted. What can I get you?
Warning. Today's stories contain one of the most disturbing and terrifying things you'll ever hear. Me attempting an Australian accent. And also extremely creepy things that happen to people working on farms. If you're excited by the idea of unsolved animal attacks, several of these stories are for you. But also, are you freaking okay? So join me, my friends, as I head to the break room with my 10-gallon jug of water for lubrication to share this hour of true and scary work stories with you. If you have a scary work story and want me to narrate it, send it to me at eriecast.com/submit. And if you want bonus content and ad-free episodes all while supporting this show, become a member at eriecast.com/plus. And if you want to see Tales from the Break Room as one of the most popular scary podcasts in the whole world, please leave us a rating and a follow on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Thank you. One quick thing. Folks were asking for some Tales from the Break Room merch. So we've got a new coffee mug with the Dead and Roasted logo available now at eriecast.store. It's super cool and makes my coffee taste demonically good. Also, some shirts with the design are coming soon too. Now then, these are Tales from the Break Room. Radio Static from Deryk. I once found myself working on a farm in the northern Midlands of Tasmania. Not exactly an area of the world many people consider when it comes to travel. I know I certainly didn't think of it when I threw my name out on an Australian farm work group on Facebook. Being raised on a grain farm in Saskatchewan, Canada, my experience running machinery was an asset that many farmers seemed keen to add to their operation for the coming harvest. One of those farmers was a guy named Bill. This isn't his real name, but I'll be changing it for anonymity's sake, and I won't give the exact location. Now, Bill offered me work on a grass farm in Tasmania, beginning around the end of December until March. I'd only lined up work until about Christmas time, so this fit perfectly into my schedule. Plus, it allowed me to miss out on the harsh Canadian winter. When I got to Tasmania, I was astonished by the scenery, with its green rolling hills and thick gum trees. To this day, and even after a second visit, the serenity of the place still takes my breath away. I say all this to paint a picture of how remote some areas of the island are. There are forests and passes that no man has stepped foot in on account of how treacherous the landscape is. The farm was situated along a fertile stretch of land, just before the Great Western Tiers. Some of the farmland took you far back into some country that most people wouldn't even think to bother adventuring to with a 4x4 vehicle to camp or hunt. Never mind doing it in a tractor to cultivate farmland. Nevertheless, I was in the hills in the earlier hours of the night. I was working late in an effort to finish disking a couple of fields in preparation for them to be seeded in the next day or two. There wasn't much for cell service out there, but I didn't mind. I enjoyed watching the sunset prematurely behind those striking peaks. Since cell phones aren't incredibly reliable in the more rural areas of Australia, farmers mainly rely on CB radios in their equipment and in their vehicles for on-the-job communication. As anyone who has experience with CB radio will tell you, their range is abysmal. If you don't have a direct line of sight to whoever it is you're talking to, the signal is incredibly weak and full of static. For this reason, Bill's brother, George, had been checking in on me throughout the day, as the yard site his house was situated on was the last one en route to the cluster of fields I was in before the road got too challenging. Every few hours he would zip out in either his ute or a four-wheeler with a radio to check in on me. At approximately 11 p.m., he checked in for the last time as he was headed home for the night. I only had a couple of hours left anyway, so I figured I would just finish up and take the tractor back to the yard site to save us some running around in the morning. As the night dragged on, I heard the distinct click that the radio makes when someone else has keyed their handset on to talk to you. I looked up to verify that was what I heard. And sure enough, the small light that turns on when you're receiving a signal was glowing. I assumed it was just an electronic error and reached up for the power button to cycle the power off and back on to remedy the issue. As soon as my finger hovered over the off switch, I heard the distinctive giggle of a young girl. The girl's voice on the other end finished its giggle, then asked, "Do you like jazz?" There was a 5-second pause, then the radio cut off. I know this isn't the most horrifying thing to hear, but remember what I said about the signal strength of these radios. That girl's voice was so loud and clear, it was like they were only 20 feet away. Furthermore, no one on this farm had a daughter within the age range of what I heard. Needless to say, I took that tractor home early. The next day, I met up with the farm's mechanic, Taylor. Taylor is your very typical no-nonsense, beer-drinking Aussie tradie. Just about the furthest thing from a skeptic as there is. He's also an avid hunter, and is familiar with all the spots within an 80-kilometer radius of the yard. Thinking it was possibly hunters out last night with a young child, I asked Taylor if he figured any hunters would have been out in that area doing a night shoot. Taylor said there was no possible way for hunters to get in back where I was, unless they were to come down that same private road I used to get into the fields. Taylor, of course, took alarm to this, as he thought I'd seen people at lights and that we had trespassers to deal with. I decided to lay it out, possibly making myself look like a fool. I explained my previous night's experience to him. I didn't get the normal Aussie banter, but instead a look of utter bewilderment and concern came across Taylor's face. "Mate, I've got nothing for yous. That's freaky," was all that he gave me. Over the next few days, the rest of the workers heard my story, and they all came to ask me about the experience. To my surprise, none of them took the piss out of me, or gave me a hard time about it. They all had the same solemn look on their faces as Taylor did. Eventually, it came Grant's turn to interview me about the event. Grant is Bill and George's dad, and has called those hills home for his full 82-year-old life. Once I told him, he kind of grinned, looked up at the horizon, and told me, "I've been here long enough to know what goes on out there. Those things don't surprise me anymore." I look at those hills differently now. Tasmania has a storied past from its previous days of Van Diemen's Land, one of hardship and violence, an island more lawless than the American West ever was. From prisoner farms to murderous cannibals and cryptic encounters. Aside from the steep banks and unmapped forests, maybe those hills have a bit more hidden within their immense stature. The Princess on the Hill, from Radwan. I'm an agronomist, specializing in desert land cultivation. This kind of job has taken me to some cool and out-of-the-way places. Egypt, as you might know, is a land rich in treasures, and also steeped in paranormal mysteries. My first brush with the supernatural happened right after I graduated, when I began working on a remote farm located about 150 kilometers away from the nearest signs of civilization. One night after finishing my work, I decided to take a walk into the open desert. There was a hill nearby where I had prepared a small campsite with a fire pit earlier. The night was eerily silent. No wind, no sounds of insects, just unnaturally still and quiet. It was also pitch dark. No moonlight or stars could be seen. Somehow it made my headlamp seem useless. I tried not to ponder on it too much. I made my way to the hill, carrying some firewood I'd gathered earlier. When I tried to light the fire, it was oddly difficult, like the wood did not want to be lit. After several minutes of struggling with it, the fire finally caught. But it wasn't right, because the flames roared like a gas torch, bright and intense, before suddenly settling down into a normal blaze. About half an hour later, I felt a sudden wave of heat pass through my body, like spots of fire pressing against my chest. Then, out of nowhere, I heard the piercing scream of a woman. It was loud, close, and I mean almost right in my ears. And yet I couldn't figure out where it was coming from. Terrified, I ran back to the farm's headquarters. When I glanced back at the hill, my fire was out. No, actually, there was no trace of it at all. Shaken up, I recounted the experience to the site manager. He listened calmly before breaking into a laugh. "She was there," he said cryptically. "Who?" I asked. "The Princess of the Hill," he replied. He explained that she was one of the jinn who originally inhabited the area. She wasn't harmful, but she despised fire. He then shared an old tale from the 1980s, when the site was first being constructed. Back then, a young security officer was stationed on the same hill. He had been strictly warned not to light any fires there, a rule he had followed for days, until boredom got the better of him. As soon as he lit a fire, a woman appeared out of the darkness, running right towards him. She confronted him, saying, "Didn't he tell you not to light a fire here?" The terrified guard fled down the hill, only to be chased by a massive black dog with gleaming teeth that nearly caught his legs. Suddenly, a white shadow appeared out of nowhere and attacked the dog. Since then, no one dared to use that hill for anything, until I unknowingly chose it as my campsite. Curious about the story, I later spoke to an old Bedouin sheik, whose tribe had lived in the area for centuries. He explained that the woman was once a mother who had perished in a fire along with her children when their tent caught ablaze. Since then, her soul had remained on the hill, protecting it and harming no one, unless someone lit a fire. If you enjoyed my story, I'm happy to share more. The desert, after all, is never truly empty. Field of Bones from EffSum. In 2003, here in northern Wisconsin, I was 32 years old, trying to keep my family's orchard running. The orchard itself was old. My grandfather planted the first row of apple trees back in the 1940s, on land that had been in use for much longer than anyone really knew. Locals sometimes whispered about old settlers' graves, or even earlier Native American burial sites, somewhere on the stretch of property. But it was usually dismissed as gossip, the kind of folklore that passes around during harvest season. I first discovered something suspicious in the early 2000s, when I tried to dig up a new irrigation ditch by the far edge of the orchard, the part where the land slopes toward a small wooded area. My shovel had hit something hard. Of course, I expected a rock, but after scraping away the dirt, I realized I was looking at a piece of bone. A leg bone, human-sized. It was an unsettling moment, standing there with a half-dug ditch, midday sun beating down, the whir of distant farm machinery, and a bone that clearly didn't belong to an animal. I called the police. An officer came out and took some photos, bagging up the remains. They told me not to disturb the area further. A week later, the county office got in touch, basically letting me know that if it was part of a historic or Native American burial site, I should contact the appropriate heritage group. At the time, I wasn't sure which group that would be, but the county did give me a name. I followed up once, got bounced around, and eventually I let the matter rest, partly because I was busy with orchard work, but also because something in me resisted the idea of digging any deeper than that. The orchard was my livelihood, and I worried any official investigation would get it shut down. Over the next year or two, life went on. I kept my orchard going with help from two seasonal farmhands, Hector and Lyle. We would prune the trees in spring, deal with irrigation in the summer, and harvest come fall. But we kept stumbling over more bones, usually small fragments. Sometimes one of us would toss aside a half-buried branch only to see a shard of human rib or a piece of skull. It was never a full skeleton, which made it somehow creepier, actually. The orchard seemed to be giving up bits of the dead, slowly and reluctantly. I did my due diligence each time, bagging up the fragments, calling the county, but the sheriff's department looked exhausted by it. They'd basically say, "Just set them aside and we'll tell you when we can send someone out." Then they never had time. The orchard was old, but these remains were even older. As best as anyone could tell, there was nothing criminal about it. Just a piece of land that had once been a resting ground for someone, or multiple someones. One deputy told me they suspected it might be a pioneer-era cemetery that was never properly recorded. Another said it could belong to a local tribe. Either way, it was unmarked and half-forgotten. That was the official side of it. Privately, though, I started to notice things. The orchard had always had its quirks, like random cold spots or wind gusts, which felt stronger than they should be. But in 2003, it got worse. During the late summer, Hector mentioned that he sometimes felt like someone was watching him from the rows. Lyle had told me he heard murmuring voices when he worked alone trimming branches. He said he looked around at the time, but didn't find anything but swaying leaves. Both of them teased each other about it, saying they're paranoid, but I made sure to take note. One afternoon, I was walking through the orchard rows, checking for pests. I swear I heard a faint chanting sound, like a chorus, rising and falling. I stopped and listened real close, but the sound faded behind rustling leaves, making me think it could have been the wind, could have been the rustling leaves themselves, but it gave me goosebumps. I brushed it off and went back to my chores. Harvest season that year was particularly strange. We had an early run of warm weather, which meant the apples were ready ahead of schedule. Hector and Lyle were picking in the back rows when I heard Lyle shout. I ran over to find him crouched by the base of a tree, white-faced. He pointed at the ground, and there, half buried in the dirt, was a human skull. Clean, empty eye sockets staring back. Lyle said he'd almost tripped over it. By then, I'd somewhat gotten accustomed to finding remains, but seeing a skull that intact was on another level. We carefully lifted it, placed it in a bucket, and took it to the barn. I made my usual call to the local authorities. They said they'd try to swing by next week. The orchard was too busy for me to wait around for them, so I just kept the skull in a sealed box until they could come. That evening, we were storing crates of apples in the barn, and the atmosphere felt tense. Hector found an excuse to leave early. He didn't seem to be feeling well. Lyle stuck around to finish the day's load, but we mostly worked quietly. Around sunset, I heard some strange thumps outside. Sounded like someone banging on a tree trunk. I stepped out to check it out. The orchard was eerily still. Then I saw movement between the trees. A figure just for a split second. It looked like a woman in a long dress, but with the way the sun was angled, I couldn't see more details. Now this part sounds crazy, but I swear she seemed to drift, not walk. My heart jumped and I blinked, thinking I was seeing things. When I peered closer, no one was there. I can't tell you because of that if it was really there or not, but from what I thought I saw, it left me shaken. A few nights later, I woke up in the middle of the night to a clattering sound in the barn. I live in the farmhouse about 200 yards from the orchard. I got out of the bed, threw on a jacket, and grabbed a flashlight. It must have been around 2 a.m. It was cold and the grass was wet with dew. I could tell from there that the barn door was slightly ajar, even though I always bolted shut each night. Inside, I found 2 crates of apples overturned, scattered across the floor. The sealed box where I'd placed the skull was open, and the skull was missing. I quickly thought maybe Hector or Lyle had come in for some reason, but that made no sense. So I called out, "Hello? Anybody here?" There wasn't a response. I flicked on the overhead light and looked in every corner. There was no sign of a forced entry, no trace of anyone having been here, except for the overturned apples and missing skull. Something about all this made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I closed the barn door and bolted it again. I then walked back to the house, feeling creeped out. The day after that, I told Lyle what happened. He told me that sounded pretty messed up. Hector wouldn't even talk about it. He just shook his head. A sheriff's deputy who finally showed up took my statement about the missing skull, but looked at me like I might be losing it. He made a note and said he'd file it away. I could tell he had no intention of investigating further. In a way, I guess I couldn't blame him for that. There was no real crime being committed here, except maybe trespassing. As the harvest wrapped up, I decided to try and find some historical records on our land. I drove to the local historical society, rummaging through old maps and diaries and some property records. Most of it indicated the orchard was farmland since the mid-1800s. But there was one battered-looking ledger mentioning several unmarked graves, but even that claimed they weren't sure if it was pioneer or native. And no one had documented precisely where they were. Another note hinted that the earliest settlers had conflicts with local tribes, and some people were buried hastily after skirmishes. Sadly, that's all I found. Just enough to confirm that my orchard sat on land with a complicated past. But the bone fragments were enough to tell me that already. The final straw came during the last week of that 2003 season. I was in the orchard alone, clearing fallen branches. By that point, the sun was nearly down. It was then that I heard the faint singing or chanting again. This time it felt closer, more layered, like there were multiple voices to it. I stood stock still, wondering where the sound was coming from, but it was both clear and vague in a way that I couldn't tell. The wind had picked up, making it more difficult, and then I caught glimpses of shadowy shapes between the rows. These weren't solid figures, more like flickers at the edges of my vision. I was honestly starting to feel scared. The orchard felt wrong, like it didn't want me here. Until then, I had never run from my own orchard before. But that night, I hurried back to the farmhouse, leaving branches where they lay. After the harvest ended, I finally made contact with a local group that dealt with ancient and historical burial sites. I explained my entire situations, bones and remains we'd found over the years. I even felt brave enough to tell them about these strange occurrences. They were surprisingly understanding. Heck, if you ask me, it almost sounded like they'd heard that before. They said they would send someone out to survey the land, see if they could confirm any old graves or sacred sites. They showed up a few weeks later. Two folks who specialized in cultural resources. They took photos and measured a few areas, making notes. They said it would likely take time to gather a full team, do proper ground-penetrating radar scans, and figure out all the next steps. They thanked me for not disturbing the site further. What really sucks, though, is I never did hear back from them. Maybe my case got lost in the bureaucracy. By the end of 2003, the orchard was quiet. I didn't hear the chanting again, and I didn't see any shadows in the corners of my eyes. And oddly enough, I stopped finding bones. Maybe those two things were coincidences to happen at the same time, or maybe they were connected. If you were to ask me right now, I think the land is haunted. But I still do wonder, who took that skull, and where might it be these days? We had problems with our calf. From Fabled Folk. This happened in eastern Montana. I had just graduated high school, and unlike most of my friends, college didn't seem like the right path for me. I got a job working at a ranch nearby. This particular ranch had a couple hundred head of cattle, spread across miles of rolling pasture. There was a big barn that always smelled of sweet hay and a bunkhouse for the seasonal hands. I moved in, thinking I'd spend maybe a year saving up some money and getting a feel for ranch life, before deciding on my next move. It didn't take long for me to realize that, on a ranch, bizarre things might happen. The strangest, by far, was the calf that came back. It was a clear summer morning, and I'd saddled up early, heading out to the south field to check on a group of cows. They'd been due to calve in the spring, so by summer, each mother usually had a sprightly little calf trotting alongside. They were super cute. We kept an eye on them, making sure none of them wandered off too far, got snagged in the barbed wire fences, got eaten by some predators, or seemed sick. I was riding along the fence line when I saw one of the black Angus calves lying still near the tall grass. I dismounted and walked over. Then I felt my heart drop. The little calf looked to be maybe a month or two old, but it wasn't breathing. As near as I could tell, the poor thing had managed to wedge its head in a small erosion hole by the fence. There weren't any marks suggesting a predator got her, and the ground around her was damp from an overnight sprinkle. My best guess was she lost her footing on the slope, got stuck, and couldn't free herself. I cursed under my breath. Losing livestock was never easy around here, especially a calf. They're the ranch's future, and when you were the one to find one like this, it always felt like it was your fault, and then you had the duty to report it. I radioed the ranch foreman, A, who told me to go ahead and load the calf onto the bed of the old pickup. A met me near the barn, took one look, and shook his head. We had a dedicated spot off by a small gully where we'd bury animals that died out in the pasture. It might sound grim, yes, but it's a normal practice when you have a ranch this big. Andrew helped me dig a proper hole, and we put the calf in. We said a few words, mostly out of respect, then covered it up. I remember noticing the calf had a distinctive white patch that looked like a little triangle on its right flank. It stood out to me because black Angus calves normally don't have that sort of white patch, hence the name. I said something about it at the time, because it made me wonder if it had some crossbreed genetics. Fast forward a few days. Work kept me busy, as it usually does. I was mending fences and moving irrigation lines, often checking salt blocks for the cattle. I was out in the west pasture one evening, counting heads to make sure all the animals were accounted for. It was then that I saw a small calf near the tree line. It caught my eye pretty quick, because it had the same exact triangular white mark on its flank. I actually felt my stomach drop. I remember what I thought then. That's not right. We buried that thing. I approached it, trying not to spook it. The calf here seemed healthy. Its ears were twitching and its tail was flicking at flies. Obviously, I was thinking I may have mixed up a different calf that also had some unusual coloring. Still, I wasn't so sure about that. That distinct shape, the exact placement. It was identical. I tried to get near enough to see its ear tag, but it trotted off to rejoin the main herd before I could read it. For the rest of the day, I wrestled with the thought that I'd seen a calf that should no longer be here. That night at supper, I casually mentioned to A and a couple of the other ranch hands. They mostly shrugged. A said we do occasionally have anomalies in coloring, or maybe I was thinking of a different calf altogether, that they just looked similar. I didn't push it. I wasn't fully convinced of my own story yet anyway. Over the next week, I was paying close attention to every calf I saw, just in case, especially those in the west pasture. We didn't have an exact head count of newborns with odd markings, so it wasn't impossible that another calf had a patch like that. But, day after day, I kept spotting the same one, same triangular patch, same size, and every time I'd try to get close to it, it would vanish into the cluster of cows. I started to joke about it in my own head, calling it the ghost calf. The turning point came one afternoon when I was out riding with my friend and fellow ranch hand. I'll call him P. We were herding a section of the cattle into a smaller enclosure for vaccinations, a routine chore. As we guided them, I spotted the calf again. I poked P with my elbow and said, "Hey, look, see that white triangle on its flank? We found a calf with that exact pattern last week, and it was dead." P raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical, and he did admit it was kind of weird. I convinced him to try to rope the calf, just a little loop around it long enough to read the ear tag. But the calf darted behind its mother, and the rope missed. Once a calf hides behind a protective cow, good luck trying to pull it away without risking a kick. When we both got back to the barn, P told A about what happened. A studied us both, then rubbed his chin, and muttered something about records. We kept decent records on births, but as I said before, we don't keep exact details of markings. Not always. They can be overlooked in a scramble. He checked the ledger and found that the only calf with a confirmed odd marking in that group was the one we had documented as deceased. Someone had even scribbled a note about that triangular patch. Our conversation went from curious to weird in a hurry. A walked out to the burial site with me the following morning, shovel in hand. He insisted we check the spot to make sure the calf was still there. Maybe a predator or a scavenger dug it up, and we'd at least find the remains. We dug, probably 2 feet down, until we hit that burlap feed sack we'd used to wrap the poor thing's hind legs. We pulled it back, and sure enough, the calf's body was right there. It was rotting, smelled foul, but definitely the same calf we'd buried. The triangular patch was visible beneath the dirt. A just stared, speechless for a second. He reburied it and didn't say much beyond, "We'll figure this out." As we left, I noticed his hands shaking a bit on the shovel. I wasn't feeling too great myself. From that point on, the entire ranch was abuzz with the news of a dead calf walking. Ranch hands started to tell stories about seeing it grazing near the water trough at dawn, or sprinting across the open field at dusk. Some guys speculated that it had been twins. Maybe the second calf shared the same markings. But identical markings, down to the shape and spot? That's not common. And we didn't have any notes about a twin birth for that mother cow. One evening, close to sunset, I decided to head out alone to the west pasture. A hunch told me I might see the calf around that time. The sky was pretty and orange. There was a gentle breeze rolling through the grass. Sure enough, after about 10 minutes of scanning the herd, I spotted it at the far edge, near an old cottonwood tree. My heart pounded. I approached it slowly on foot, not wanting to spook it. As I got closer, the calf seemed calm, like it didn't mind me. I began talking in a low voice, the way you do with animals sometimes, just letting it know I wasn't a threat. But then it turned its head, and I swear there was something in those eyes that unsettled me. Not a typical calf's wide-eyed stare. I can't describe it exactly. Maybe a kind of recognition or sadness. I inched close enough to finally see the ear tag number, 235. Felt like my heart stopped, because that was the tag number of the deceased calf. No doubt about it. I nearly dropped my flashlight. Before I could do anything else, the calf jerked its head, made a strange low bleating sound, and took off. Not just a lazy trot, more a frantic run, weaving through the other cattle. The next morning, I told A I'd confirmed the tag number. He didn't even try to accuse me of lying. He knew better than that, but I could see that he was at a loss, like the rest of us. We decided the only way to settle this was to catch the calf, physically verify everything. He assembled a few of the ranch hands, and we pinned the herd in the corral. We systematically separated cows and calves, checking ear tags. We found 234, 236, 237, but no 235. We combed that corral for a good hour, and not once did we see the triangular patch or the ear tag. We turned the herd back out. All of us were silent. I overheard some of the older ranch hands whisper that it's a curse, comparing it to old legends they heard. Something about animals refusing to die, returning if their spirit was restless, that it might happen when they're buried in sacred ground. The rest of us tried to make a joke of it, saying someone was messing around or pulling pranks. But I wasn't laughing. I was starting to feel anxious every time I stepped into that pasture. A week or two passed by without any sightings. Then, as if the ranch itself had decided to move on from the mystery, everything went back to normal chores. Branding a new batch of cattle, repairing the well pump, dealing with a mild outbreak of pink eye in some cows. Number 235 became a half-forgotten conversation piece, something the guys would bring up around the bunkhouse after a few beers. "You see that ghost calf again?" they'd say and chuckle. I didn't see it again until late August. I was driving an old ATV along the perimeter fence at dusk, checking for gaps. The wind was cold, a hint of the coming fall, and right there beyond the boundary where the ranch meets open range, I saw a calf. Black body, triangular patch, ear tag glinting in the last bit of sunlight. It stood perfectly still, almost like it was waiting for me to notice. My gut twisted, remembering the last time I saw that number. 235. I stopped the ATV and killed the engine. We just stared at each other across the tall grass. Then, in a moment, the calf turned and bounded off into the distance. For a split second, I had this wild urge to chase it and kill it. But it ran beyond our fence line into land we didn't own. I knew I had no right to follow it out there. Instead, I sat there, confused, watching it eventually vanish into the hills. That was the final time I saw the calf. After that, everything returned to the mundane realities of ranch life. I'm still at that ranch. I moved up to an assistant foreman role. Every now and then I look back on that summer, how we found that calf's remains in the burial site, and how it came back. If you ever find yourself in eastern Montana, driving past a herd on a ranch, keep your eyes peeled. You might catch a glimpse of that triangular patch and ear tag number 235, roaming between the hills like it never left. Barn Beast, from Eric M. For a while, I lived in the high desert of eastern Oregon. I had a buddy named Clay who owned a ranch. Sometimes I'd done work for him, and one day I got a call from him. He said he remembered I was pretty good with horses and not afraid to sleep under the stars if I needed to. I noticed that Clay sounded on edge on the phone. He began to explain a problem to me. Every few nights, one of his goats or a sheep turned up dead. He had no idea if it was coyotes or a mountain lion or something else entirely. The odd part was the fence around his livestock pen was partially torn, but not the way a coyote would do it. Looked shredded, he said, like something with real strong claws or big teeth had done the job. Clay asked if I'd come out and help watch the animals at night. Said he couldn't afford any more losses. I took him up on it, because honestly, I was a friend of Clay and I needed the extra cash. And I grew up hearing stories around these parts about farm predators and weird occurrences in the desert. Some part of me was excited about that idea, that maybe this could be exciting. Clay's ranch sits a good 20 miles outside of town, near a lonely stretch of road. It's got big hills, patches of junipers, and miles of grassland. He mostly raised cattle, but had recently added a flock of sheep and a small group of goats. It seems the goats were the ones getting hit the hardest. Whatever was out there had a taste for him. When I arrived, Clay was waiting for me by his old barn. The man was in his 50s and tough as nails. with that sun-beaten face that tells you he spent a lifetime in his craft. He led me around the back where he kept the livestock pen. I remember thinking, I'll be darned. One of the corners of the chain-link fence was in bad shape, twisted and pulled outward. It had been patched with more wire, but it still looked pretty rough. "Check this out," Clay said, pointing to the fence. "I ain't never seen a coyote do that kind of damage. Wolf, maybe, but we haven't had confirmed wolf sightings here in years." He walked me over to a small enclosure behind the barn. That's when that rank smell hit me. The carcass of a goat, partially devoured. There were flies buzzing around it. I tried not to breathe too deeply. Clay had left it in place for me to take a look. I crouched down, noticing the bite marks looked large, bigger than a typical coyote's jaws. Whatever had done it was real messy too, not like the neat latching on a big cat sometimes does. These were deep puncture wounds on the neck and shoulders. "You sure it's not a mountain lion?" I asked. Clay shrugged. "Could be. Local game warden's been out here though. He said the tracks don't quite match up. Heck if I know." He showed me a footprint in the dust. It was broad, not canine and not feline. It was smeared, so it was tough to be sure anyway. Nonetheless, it gave me the creeps. I'd seen dozens of animal tracks before, and I've never seen something like that. The first night, we set up a watch. Clay had a 30-30 rifle, and I had my own trusty 243. We posted ourselves in folding chairs near the barn, made sure to have a lantern glowing real low next to us. The livestock pen lay about 40 yards away, with a weak floodlight illuminating the fence line. The animals seemed unsettled, occasionally bleating or huddling together. Maybe I was thinking too much about whatever this thing was, but I was starting to empathize, getting creeped out myself. Clay and I just sat there scanning for movement. Around midnight, with the moon high in the sky and the night getting cold, I was about to suggest we take turns going to sleep, and we suddenly heard a soft clanging on the fence. We turned our rifles in that direction. For a second, I thought I saw a dark shape slip away from the pen, but it vanished too quick to tell if it was an actual creature of some sort, or shadows playing with my eyes. Clay got up, walked over with his lantern, but found nothing. The fence was intact, no signs of tears or footprints. The next couple of days we went about ranch chores. I helped Clay repair more fences and guided the livestock to graze in different parts of the pasture. We also did some searching for tracks around the perimeter, looking for anything we could cast or photograph. We found a few scattered prints, all inconclusive though. A few were deep in the mud near the water trough, almost shaped like a canine print, but longer. Another was near the barn door, as if something heavy had pressed down real hard. But still, we couldn't be sure. Night after night, we took up positions near the barn. Clay had even put out extra motion sensor lights around the pen. He also tried hooking up a small radio out there, thinking that the human voices might scare off predators. We often heard distant howls. Coyotes, definitely. But none of them ever ventured too close. Everything stayed pretty quiet, until one morning. I woke up to Clay pounding on my bunkhouse door. "Another one," he said, looking grim. We headed out to find a ewe partially eaten, lying in the corner of the pen. The fence was torn again, this time on the opposite side, and we hadn't heard a thing. The motion lights didn't even trigger. No one fired a shot, like whatever this thing was slipped in and out without a sound. Clay's face was red with frustration. I don't think I've ever seen him so mad. He was cussing up a storm and kicking at a broken fence post. We tried a new tactic, moving the livestock into a smaller, sturdier corral closer to the barn. We put up fresh wiring and locked them in at night. Clay installed trail cameras around the perimeter. For a few days, we caught nothing but the usual ranch wildlife. Some possums, some stray cats or two, a couple of deer crossing the property. Then on the fourth night, something attacked. We heard the racket this time. The goats screaming, fence rattling violently. Clay and I dashed outside with our rifles and flashlights. The corral fence was shaking as if someone was beating on it. By the time we reached it, everything went still. One of the goats lay on its side, bleeding from jagged wounds across the neck. The others milled around, panicked. Our flashlight beam swept over the corral, but we saw no predator, nothing even running off into the darkness. Clay checked the gate. It was still locked. Some of the fence bars were bent outward, like something had almost pried them. "How does something bend steel bars?" he muttered. This time he sounded scared and mad. When we examined the trail cameras the next day, each one of them was asking us to format the SD card. User error or something, so we had no idea if they really caught anything. At that point, Clay considered calling an old friend of his, a professional tracker from up north. But if you ask me, something about the situation felt beyond normal tracking expertise. I remember telling Clay, either this is a mountain lion with freakish strength or something else that should not be here. We tried a final stakeout, the last one I participated in before I had to leave for another job. This time we got inside the barn's loft, giving us a higher vantage point over the corral. The night just dragged on. I didn't think anything was going to happen, but something did near dawn. That's when I heard a faint scraping sound like claws on wood. I whispered to Clay, "You hear that?" And he nodded. We peered through a gap in the boards. Suddenly, the goats started to bleat frantically. We rushed down the ladder, flung open the barn door, rifles aimed. Something behind the corral moved, a shadowy figure slipping away into the brush. We both saw it though, maybe just the barest of glimpses, but we saw something. It was large, hunched, covered in dark fur, but in a pattern that looked patchy, like half mangy. We caught it in time to see it vault over a low section of fence impossibly fast, before disappearing. Within that time frame, Clay fired 2 rounds, but didn't hit it. One of the goats lay near the fence, wounds still fresh. They looked like razor-sharp claw marks. A couple of days later, I packed up my things. I had other obligations, and sadly I had to leave Clay to handle the ranch on his own. I had to say goodbye to him with an unsettling handshake. He thanked me for coming out, and said he would keep in touch. A month later, I got a call from him with good news. He said the attacks had finally stopped, just as mysteriously as they started. He never did find out what it was. The only sign was a final set of gouges in the fence, as though something had tested it one last time before moving on. It's not the most vivid sighting, sure. We never got a close look, were never directly attacked by it. But to really experience something like that in real life, it chills you to the bone, gives you a good, confused fright that you won't forget for the rest of your life. The kind of thing you're good for weeks at a time without thinking about. Then you'll have that random night where you remember it, and suddenly you're scared of the dark for at least an evening. Anyway, that's my story, and thank you all for listening. Paranormal Prankster from Clark H.T. I'd like to tell you I'm a pretty practical guy. Never really think about the paranormal. Get up before sunrise every day and tend to the fields. After some local news, I go to bed. No fuss, no drama. In fact, I have no idea how to use computers very well either. My niece is typing this for me, bless her heart. I wanted to write this out due to some similar stories I've heard on the Unexplained Encounters podcast. It happened one summer in 2015. If I'd known what was going to happen that night, I would have went to bed early. My farm is a modest patch of land in southern Iowa, the kind of place where you can usually see headlights from your neighbor's driveway if you stand in the right spot. Not too remote, not exactly urban either. Think a lot of fields, a few scatterings of trees, and a long gravel road that leads to the highway. I grow soybeans and some corn, alternating each season. It pays the bills, and what goes past that, we save or give to friends and family. It was mid-June when this happened. I was out in the field past dinner time because the forecast warned of heavy rains the next day, and I really had to finish spraying some herbicide on the soybeans. I had been putting it off for a while, and the cost of seeds and supplies those days were getting high, which is nothing compared to now, but you know what I mean. And letting weeds overrun your fields could cripple you for the season. I hopped in my old tractor around sunset, figuring a few hours more wouldn't kill me. It didn't take long for me to get lost in the routine like usual. I lined up the sprayer, drove straight, keeping an eye out for clumps of weeds. The engine chugged along, steady. The sound had always comforted me. A couple of times I had to fight going to sleep. Somewhere after 10, I started to feel the usual nighttime hush settle in. There were no birds, no distant hum of other machinery. Just me and some crickets. An occasional breeze would come straying in through the neighbor's cornfield, but that was about it. I was halfway through my last pass, and I noticed something moving along the far edge of the field. Deer, I thought. They were always out there looking for an easy meal in the rows. I flicked on the auxiliary lights for a better view, but whatever it was had already slipped behind the soybean plants, out of my sight. Not my problem at the moment, I thought. Wildlife is part of the package out here in rural Iowa, so I kept going. A few minutes later, I caught movement again. This time it was closer. The shape was low to the ground, crawling on all fours like a dog. So that's what I thought it was. Maybe a neighbor's stray dog, or heck, even a wild dog. There was the rare chance it was a coyote, but with everybody out here having guns for just that, it was doubtful. Those critters had the fear of God in them. So to me, at the moment, it was a dog, or maybe a feral hog. I slowed down the tractor and shone my headlights in that direction. But then the figure darted away, sticking close to the darker spots at the edge of my beam. That was something, I thought, but not enough to keep me from finishing my job. I'd done my due diligence to try to see what it was. No sense in dwelling on some animal that clearly didn't want to be found. Coyote, dog, or hog, I'd find signs of it in the field eventually, like scat or paw prints. With that in mind, I kept going. I moved to a new section of the field, and things started to escalate. The perimeter fence sat about 50 yards to my left right there, and in the corner of my eye I glimpsed something climb over it. It was an odd enough shape, something tall, that it made me slam the brake and look. Through the glare of the headlights, I couldn't make out the details, just a silhouette. But they were standing upright, like a person, and it did look human in shape. But the limbs were off, too long and too spindly. If it was a person, maybe they were holding something in their hands. But it gave me a chill. Shouldn't be nobody out here on this property after dark. I stared at it for a moment, wondering if my eyes were just finding human-like shapes in the dark, like you do when you're a kid and you're looking at clothes in a laundry basket in your room or on your chair. I had to be sure it wasn't a trespasser. But then it started to move, and the way it moved was weirdly graceful. I raised an eyebrow, and just then, it dropped back out of sight. I'm not the type to spook easily. I hear that a lot on these shows, but I've lived here my whole life. I've seen weird weather phenomena, had raccoons jump at me from behind hay bales out of nowhere, the works. But something about the way that figure moved gave me the heebie-jeebies. I had a decision to make. Keep on working or head back to the farmhouse and go to bed. Tackle it in the early morning. Stubborn pride told me I'd come this far and it was my land and no one else's, so I might as well finish. I was nearly done spraying when I heard a scratching sound on the rear of my tractor. It was faint, but I could hear it, and I wondered if I had run over something that got caught in the wheel. I turned in my seat, expecting some unseen branch or limb to be scratching at the metal of the tractor. Instead, I didn't see anything but shadows. I pointed a flashlight back there. Nothing. Just the empty hitch and the sprayer rig. I was getting a bit creeped out. I was a bit hesitant, but I got out anyway, I did a walk around with the flashlight. Everything looked normal. There was no damage or debris, nothing caught in the wheels. That didn't make me feel better. It just made me more confused as to what I'd heard. I climbed back in and fired up the tractor once more. Not 3 minutes later, this real eerie sound reached me through the cab's open window. I swear to God, it sounded like a laugh. A soft and raspy laugh. Like someone holding back a cough and laughing at the same time. I swiveled around, looking all over for something, anything. The hairs on my arms stood straight up. My instincts were telling me this was not a normal person's laugh, more like a mocking imitation of one. I flicked on the interior cab light, needing some sense of security, but it only made the outside darker by contrast. I turned the tractor around then, deciding I'd had enough for the night. The last row could wait. Just as I started to head back, the engine sputtered. That machine was old, but it hardly ever gave me trouble. I shifted gears, trying to keep it from stalling. That laugh came again, this time coming from the opposite side of the field, like something was moving around me in a circle. I gunned the throttle, forcing the tractor toward the gravel road. I then felt a thud on the metal roof of the cab. It sounded like someone had landed on it. I can't lie to you here, I began to panic. I ducked, forgetting that there was a roof above me. I couldn't see anything from inside the cab, so I reached for the door handle, but then waited. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to not open that door. But I had to know what was on top of me. I cracked the door open, and I shone the flashlight up. Nothing there. Not a soul, not even a dent. But there was fresh scratch marks on the metal, like someone's filthy long nails had been raked across. My hand was shaking so hard, I couldn't keep the flashlight straight. Then there was another laugh, echoing somewhere further away, deeper in the field. I swear to God it sounded amused. Something was out here playing with me, and it was happy how scared it got me. I slammed the door shut, nearly dropping the darn flashlight. I jammed the tractor back into gear, ignoring the strain of the engine, and took off down the road. In the mirror, I thought I saw a flicker of a lanky figure, bounding across the rows on all fours, but I didn't look directly. Too scared to. When I finally reached the safety of my driveway, the tractor sputtered out for good, and I abandoned it right there in front of the barn. My legs felt real wobbly as I dashed toward my farmhouse. That was one of the scariest moments of my life, sprinting from the tractor to the door, in utter darkness, knowing that there was something out there with me. I made it okay, and I locked every door, checked every window, and I sat on that living room couch for an hour, hugging a rifle in my lap. I was waiting for something to try to get in, but that never happened. The next day I double-checked. There were scratch marks on that tractor roof. The soil around the area where I'd stopped was turned up too. Footprints from something on 2 legs it looked like, switching to a 4-legged stride. I was desperate to try to make sense of it. Maybe I was misreading a pattern. Maybe there was a bunch of animals out here for some reason, churning everything up. But it didn't look like a deer or a coyote or a dog. Too wide, too uneven. I called a buddy in town who does a bit of coyote hunting. Told him the gist of the story, without too many crazy details. He agreed to come by that evening, see if we could spot something. By the time dusk rolled around, though, I'd lost my nerve. I was telling myself if we went looking, we may not make it back. So I never really went to investigate with him. Told him to just go home, and thanked him for coming out. I haven't sprayed a field after dark since. I'll be honest with you. I start leaving the fields a little overgrown once dusk settles in. Sure, it can make you lose a bit of the yield, but nothing's worth feeling that kind of raw fear again. Like you're just a rat in a maze, for something that thinks it's entertaining to watch you squirm. Have you ever been that scared? So scared that a 5-second run back to your front door has you panicking nearly for your life, and you can almost feel something right behind you, ready to drag you away into the dark. That's how I felt that one time Dunkin' Donuts accidentally put like a dozen nitro shots in my coffee or something, man. I'm still here by some miracle. Thanks for tuning in to another Tales from the Break Room. I'm Darkness Prevails, and if you aren't following me on Twitter at Dark Prevails for the upcoming war against the uncaffeinated, you're doing something wrong with your life. Just kidding. Really, all you're missing are some really cool pictures of our brand new Dead and Roasted coffee mug, now available at eeriecast.store. If you have a scary work story, send it to me at eeriecast.com/submit. Unlock exclusive content and get ad-free episodes at eeriecast.com/plus. Before I go, do me the biggest favor if you can. Follow and review Tales from the Break Room on Spotify and Apple Podcasts if you haven't already. It's quick, it's free, and it's our best chance at making this podcast one of the top shows in the world. And we couldn't do it without you. Thank you. I'll be clocking out now, but don't you worry. I'll be clocking in again real soon with more stories.